And welcome everyone once again to Tim's Final Confessions. I'm Tim Durling, my very special guest, Bud Campbell. And if Andy's back, you, probably read the description. That means we're doing a by the year show. How are we doing, Bud?
Excellent. Can't wait to talk about 1973. I think this is my third time on your channel. And yeah, like you said, we did a couple of year recaps before. I believe 1989 and 1987 were the ones I appeared on.
Yes.
And so we're going.
Those are always well received. And surprisingly enough, I put this idea out to our regular crew, and nobody else seemed to think they could come up with 10 albums from 1973. So the two of us are going to do this. I'm looking forward to see, as always, what we have in common and what we have that's different. So yeah, neither of us were born in 73. We were both born in 74. So this is music, obviously, that we discovered well after the fact.
Yeah, when I came up with my list, I realized that there was a lot of great bands that released debut albums in 1973. And there were a few other bands that were massive rock bands at the time. So I'm sure we'll touch on all of those. And like you said, I've got a few that I know wouldn't be on your list, and I know that you've got a few that won't be on my list. So we'll be talking about a lot of different albums today.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I'm looking forward to this. So yeah, we each came up with a list, and I'm going to let Bug start us off with his honorable mention.
Yeah, so it didn't make my list, but I thought we'd be remiss not to show this one. Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. Obviously a massive record that spent weeks and weeks and weeks on the Billboard 100 chart, or the 200
years, I think. In the top 200. Incredible longevity. Yeah, you're right. Somebody would call us out if we didn't.
Yeah. So I mean, I have a copy of this on vinyl. It's a good one, but it didn't make my top 10. So that's my honorable mention.
Cool. Well, my honorable mention is actually built into my actual top 10, and we'll get to that in a second. So why don't you also go ahead and give us your number 10?
So my number 10 album is one that we'll see later on by the same artist. This would be Alice Cooper, Muscle of Love. This would be the last album Alice Cooper would make as a band before he went solo. So this is my my copy. It's the Warner Burbank label. This is a Canadian pressing, produced by Jack Richardson and Jack Douglas. So this was the first one that Bob Ezrin didn't produce. I think Easy Action he produced everything after that.
He produced Love It to Death and Killers. He produced all the big ones for sure.
He produced all the big Alice Cooper albums. I think at the time they said that he was recovering from an illness, but I think Dennis Dunaway has said that there was a big argument about arrangements on this album, and they kind of didn't want to produce.
The band members didn't want to go full on theatrical. But I mean, obviously Ezrin would continue to work with Alice to this very day.
Right.
I mean, he produced the next three Alice Cooper solo albums. So, but yeah, Jack Richardson at the time, I think this was his first. Not Jack Richardson. Sorry, Jack Richardson was well known at this time for producing the Guess Who. He's one of the biggest. He's one of the legendary Canadian producers. I mean, he produced the Guess Who. He produced Brighton Rock. So, and he's sadly no longer with us. His son Garth Richardson is also a well-known producer and engineer. If you've ever seen Garth Richardson's name, he's Jack's son.
Okay.
But Jack Douglas started as an engineer, as a lot of producers do, under Bob Ezrin, and this, I believe, was his first production credit. And he, of course, would go on to great fame producing Aerosmith through most of the 70s. So yeah. Now, your copy, does it fold out? Is it the full?
It's the minor version, I guess. It just has the cardboard sleeve. It doesn't have the shallow box.
Yeah. So it must be a reissue.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. It has the inner sleeve, which is pretty beat up. And the other insert that came with it, in my copy, it only has a small cutout of.
Okay.
Class of 74. There was more to this when it came, but if you know who the band 5440 is, I'm sure, working in radio.
Oh yeah.
Ocean Pearl, if you listen to the opening of Ocean Pearl, never been sold before. It's the exact same guitar intro.
See, I thought Never Been Sold Before sounded like Nazareth Hair the Dog before
Listen
it
to
came out.
440's
But
Ocean
they're
Pearl.
both kind of down, down. They're very similar. Yeah. Wow.
Similar. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and that's one that I was lucky enough to find. I found it at an antique store, and it was in the box. Like it had all the stuff with it. Amazing packaging, but a little bit unwieldy, and that might have. It's the only one of those Alice Cooper band albums that, you know, once they get big, that didn't go platinum. It stalled at gold. Didn't have any big hits off of it. A lot of people, I think, thought that when they bought the album, it had like a grease stain on it.
yes, I did. I was just going to
So
say, I
yeah,
thought
they
that was a
all look
great
like
thing.
that. It's supposed to look like that. If
Yeah.
anybody's starting out collecting Alice vinyl, it's a really cool. It's like a really good example of '70s album packaging.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
that's my number 10 album, Tim.
Okay. My number 10 is I had to put this on here, but I put it at 10. This is Yes, Tales from Topographic Oceans. And this is it's a controversial album within Yes fans, because I don't know if you can see that or not, but there are only 4 songs on this, and this is a double album. This is stretched over 2 records. Very, very long compositions, and there are some fantastic musical moments on here, but there aren't really anything that you could call songs. This album was usually held up as, by people that do not like progressive rock, as the ultimate example of self-indulgence and just noodling away in the studio. And there is a lot of spaces on here where they're just noodling away. Rick Wakeman, keyboard player, has said many times that if CDs had been around, they would have had no problem. They didn't have enough material for a double album. They had too much material for one record. So he said they padded it out. He said, I can hear where the padding is, and it drives me crazy. I hear it every time. I hear where they're just playing something over and over again just to fill up the space. Like I said, the best parts of this are when they would do portions of it live, but there is some incredible material on here. And I do have to say, even in this small form, Roger Dean's cover art still looks really, really cool. So that is my number 10.
So Rick Wakeman is going to make another appearance on this episode in my number 1.
I bet I know what one. Yeah. Yeah.
So my number 9 album is actually 2 different albums by the same artist, released in 1973. So this is Greetings from Asbury Park, New Jersey, and The Wild, The Innocent, and the E Street Shuffle, both by Bruce Springsteen. His first 2 albums that he released, both on Columbia Records. He wasn't quite the boss yet. He was still, the E Street Band was still developing. They still had that bar band kind of feel to them. Probably the best bar band in America at the time, but they weren't quite at the peak they were when they hit Born to Run. So these were kind of stepping stone albums for Bruce Springsteen. There are some bad songs on his first album, Greetings from Asbury Park. Mary Queen of Arkansas and The Angel. Those are considered 2 of Bruce Springsteen's worst songs. The second album, he brings a little bit more jazz into it. It's only 7 songs, and they average about 7 minutes in length. The closer, New York City Serenade, is about 10 minutes long. But you can still hear the Bob Dylan influence in him, but he brings in the jazz with that second album. So that's Bruce Springsteen. My number 9 album of 1973.
Yeah, I remember when I was younger. I mean, you know, when I thought of Springsteen, I thought Born in the USA. I thought Dancing in the Dark and Glory Days.
Right.
And I remember hearing that first album of his. It doesn't even sound like him. Like
No.
it's very, very Bob Dylan. Like it's
Very
even in his vocals. And you know, probably of those 2 albums, the best known song is probably a song that not his version of it.
That's right.
A little song called Blinded by the Light. Yeah.
Yeah.
So okay, that's funny, because I was wondering when you said 2 in the same year. I'm like, is he going to pick the same 2 I am? Because that's exactly what I'm doing. This is where I said my honorable mention was sort of, you know, written into the number 9 spot. It's really hard for me to separate these 2 albums. They both came out in '73. Nazareth, Razmanaz, and Loud and Proud. And I love these Canadian A&M 8-tracks because A&M really put time into the packaging. Because look at this, they even have back covers.
Wow.
If you've seen like some of the Styx albums, they have band pictures on the back covers. It's pretty cool actually. And the reason I'm considering these two together is because they were recorded, I think, one right after the other, and it's just one batch of songs, one on one batch, one on the other. So a lot of these songs, I know a lot of people that have Nazareth's greatest hits, and that's all they have. So a lot of these songs would be familiar, like the title song "Razmaz," a pretty darn heavy song for 1973. Woke Up This Morning, Bad Bad Boy, Broken Down Angel. A really, really sinister song that wouldn't sound out of place on a Sabbath album called "Sold My Soul." I'd recommend somebody checking that. It's pretty dark sounding. But yeah, there's some good stuff on here. And then we move on to, I think, the album I like a little bit more of the two, although, like I said, they are very, very similar. Loud and Proud. Best known song off here is their really heavy or rocked up version of Joni Mitchell's "This Flight Tonight," which gets airplay to this very day. Teenage Nervous Breakdown is a really good one. I think that's the Little Feat cover. Not really sure. There's a song in here called "Not Faking It" that, if anyone's a fan of Michael Monroe from Hanoi Rocks, I think he covered that song at some point. "Turn On Your Receiver," that's on the greatest hits. Let's see. Obviously, "This Flight Tonight." But another really dark one on here, we talked about Bob Dylan. There's actually a Bob Dylan cover, and it takes up the entirety of Program 4, called "The Ballad of Hollis Brown." That's very Sabbath-like, too. It's very doomy and dark. Yeah, you'd be surprised if anybody, all they know from Nazareth is "Love Hurts." They had some heavy stuff early. And yes. I think that I've never actually read this, but I think that Dan McCafferty on vocals, he had to have an influence on Brian Johnson, that raspy vocal, and probably a guy like Tom Kiefer too, because that raspy vocal approach. But yeah, those two come in at my number 9.
See, I thought the two you were going to put together were the Alice Cooper ones, but I forgot Nazareth had 2 LPs out in 1973.
Yeah.
So my number 8 album is by the New York Dolls.
Yeah, influential. I as about any, like, I think more people know of this band than actually know their music.
That's right. They were critically acclaimed, but they didn't sell a whole lot of albums. And they didn't have a whole lot of musical talent or ability, but Sylvain, who was one of the band members, he said, "Just fake it till you make it." And what they lacked in musical ability, they sure made up for in attitude and image. So this is a U.S. press on Mercury.
Yeah,
it's got the custom label on it. And this is the original inner sleeve. It's got pretty cheeky.
Yeah.
So they were kind of categorized as a glam rock band or a sleaze rock. Some call them proto-punk. Whatever category you put the band into, you can't deny the influence that they had on punk rock, even Kiss, and obviously Guns N' Roses were a big influence on them. So that's my number 8. I should mention Todd Rundgren produced that album. Famous. He had a big album around that time. I can't remember the name of it. But he produced the album. They didn't last very long, that band. I mean, like I said, they didn't.
Yeah, they only did a couple of albums, and then they did at least a couple of albums in like the 2000s in a reconfigured.
Right, and of course, David Johansen, the lead singer, was Buster
Poindexter. That's when I first heard of him. Hot, yeah. And then around that time, I remember, you might remember this too, on Much Music on the Pepsi Power Hour, they played a video for well, this wasn't a video, but it was a clip, and I think it was Personality Crisis.
Yes,
from a German TV show. So it was like, that's the same guy. Yeah, they were kind of Stonesy too. Like, he had a Mick Jagger look and sound.
Yeah.
And yeah, they were very, very influential. When I a few years ago, I was in St. John, I actually saw that first album on 8-track.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. You rarely see.
Just look at it. I mean, look at that. They paved the way for.
They did.
The LA Sunset Strip. I mean,
They're in drag on the album cover, and in I think it was in Walk This Way, Stephen Davis's Aerosmith book. They talk about Joe and Stephen going to New York before they released their first album, and it wasn't an act. Like, they were walking around in drag for that kind of
Yeah,
shock.
platforms and high heels, and yeah. And it's funny you mentioned Aerosmith too. I think it's Arthur Kane was their bass player.
Yes.
I think he and Tom Hamilton are doppelgangers. They always look like each other to me. Yeah, cool. So yeah, my number 8, we've talked about it. Bug's shown it off. It is Alice Cooper, Muscle of Love. The reason I didn't talk about these together, and I'm guessing your thoughts are the same. They're completely different albums. Like they're not. There's other than the fact they came out in the same year. They're very very different.
Yep.
So yeah, obviously this is using this for the front cover, and I actually like this album. This is a controversial statement, but I like this album better than I like the School's Out album, and I'd almost go so far as to say better than I like the Killer album. But I think some good songs on here. Like you said, Never Been Sold Before. I love the title song. Man with a Golden Gun. That was written because they knew at the time the James Bond movies were still following the book series, and they knew the next one was going to be Man with a Golden Gun. So they wrote this song, and it was rejected. But it's perfect. If you listen to it, it would have been a perfect opener. But Alice Cooper's image at the time was too controversial, too wild. But you listen to it now and you're like, man, this would have fit right in. Yeah, the best known song on here is probably Teenage Lament 74. And interesting, you listen to it's got so many background vocalists on it. It's got Liza Minnelli, it's got the Pointer Sisters. It's like they kind of threw everything but the kitchen sink into this album. It did go gold, but it didn't do as well as the previous ones. And it did signal the end of the Alice Cooper group. So they split up sometime in 74. But man, they've been going since 1969. They literally released 7 albums in 5 years. Like, it's no wonder they combusted, because you just can't keep up that pace and being on the road and hard partying like they were. But to me, and this is where I think we show our age a little bit. I think the best stuff was yet to come for Alice myself.
Yeah.
But
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So there you go. That's my number 8.
All right. So my number 7 is by Deep Purple.
Yeah.
Who do you think we are? So this is a Canadian press on a lot of my albums from 1973 are the Warner Burbank.
They had a lot of. They were a big label for heavy rock at that time. They may have been the biggest.
I couldn't believe once I started putting these together how many of them were on this label.
Yeah,
and it comes with the purple lyric insert.
Yeah.
So this was the end of the Mark II era.
Mark II, yeah.
And
it was the end of it for the first time.
End of it for the first time, and it got mixed reviews. I read that it was the sound of a band breaking up. But like you said about Alice Cooper, they were touring and they were partying, and that catches up to you. So, but there's some great tracks on this. Like, besides the most well-known track, which is obviously A Woman from Tokyo, but Super Trooper, Smooth Dancer, Rat Bat Blue, all excellent tracks. And something that surprised me was that they were the best-selling artists in the United States in 1973.
Yeah,
it's this album with the
people forget how big Deep Purple were. Like, yeah. It's interesting because if I'd had like a number 12, number 11, it probably would have been that album. I don't like it as much as In Rock or Machine Head, but it's still, I mean, it's still good. It's still got some good stuff on it. I only have it on vinyl, and my vinyl copy, even though I found it at Backstreet in Fredericton, it's a UK edition on EMI, and it's really shiny. Like, the sleeve is like shiny and almost plastic. I don't know if it's rare, but it's just the one that happened to be there.
I've got a few UK albums, and they do seem to be shinier. Like, the outer sleeves seem to be a lot shinier than they are in North America. So, not surprised.
Yeah, Deep Purple, of course, they're a good example of a band that wasn't on one label all over the world, which that makes for some interesting collecting things, because you can end up with the same album on several different labels. speaking of, I regret that this is the only one that you're going to see out of my collection that I don't have on 8-track yet, but it's coming. I've only got the CD version of this, actually. So my number 7 is ZZ Top Tres Hombres, their third album. And this is the Rhino Records reissue. And yeah, this would originally have been on London Records, but of course they got reissued through Warner Brothers. The CD's got some personalization on it, which is kind of cool. It was their third album. It was their first really big album. This featured their first song that got a lot of radio play, of course, was LaGrange. And but it's also got songs that they would do in concert forever. Like they always do them one after the other, Wait for the Bus, and then Jesus Just Left Chicago. Beer Drinkers and Hellraisers is a heavy one, for the time. I think Motorhead does a version of that. There's some really, like, Billy Gibbons is a storyteller, even if you don't know what he's talking about. But Master of Sparks, Precious and Grace, those are really, really odd songs, but they're really cool songs. Love his lyrics, Chic, I met his Chic from Mozambique. And this reprints, this was the original gatefold of the album, this Mexican Meal here. And like I said, they were surprisingly heavy. Like if you only know ZZ Top from the Eliminator or Afterburner era, you haven't really heard ZZ Top. I mean,
Right.
That was where we first got to know them, right? But their older stuff is just really, really cool. And some of it, you'd be surprised how heavy it is. Also, it's neat looking at them before their beards completely grew out. But yeah, this is a really, really good album, and had to include it here at some place. So that's my number 7.
Excellent. So my number 6 album is Mott the Hoople. Mott.
Another very influential band.
Didn't get a lot of success in the US. Kind of compare them to Slade, where they were more popular in the UK than they were in North America. But it was on Columbia Records. Yeah. I recently, just a couple of weeks ago, found this double CD, The Ballad of Mott. It's a retrospective, and it's a really good career spanning.
You got it's the double CD case.
Double CD. So little history on the band. They put a few albums out starting in 69 through 71. They were on the verge of breaking up because they didn't have any success. David Bowie comes in, says, I'll produce your album. He was a fan of theirs, wanted them to stay together. He offered them, I didn't know this until I was doing a little bit of research, but he actually offered them Suffragette City first, and the band didn't want it.
I didn't know that. I know what obviously they did take.
Right. And that wasn't the one they actually wanted. They asked for another one. I can't remember the name of it. And then they finally settled on All the Young Dudes.
Yeah.
It became kind of their breakthrough song, which I first heard, I believe it was in the early 90s. Bruce Dickinson.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
And so that was the first time I had heard of the band. And then the next time was right around the same time was Contraband, which featured Bob Lutzer on drums, Tracy Guns, Michael Schenker. They covered All the Way from Memphis, which would be kind of the big song on that album, this Mott album. Sharon, another connection to that, Sharon Peterson, who played bass for Vixen, who was in Contraband, she ended up playing bass in the Down and Outs, which is Joe Elliott.
And he loves Mott the Hoople, all things Mott the Hoople,
yeah. So the Down and Outs opened for Mott the Hoople. I think it was in 2009 when they reunited for a few shows in London. So yeah, I'm sure they had to compare set lists and listen.
Yeah,
we're playing these. You can play anything else, but don't play the same song. So the only other time I heard of them was also in the 90s. Motley Crue on their 94 album with John Corabi. One of the songs,
the Mott the Hoople, Poison Apples,
Poison Apples, that's the one. Yeah. So I heard a lot about them in the 90s. Didn't really get into the band until I started collecting vinyl about 10, 15 years ago. And good band, and that's my number 6 album.
Cool. Not to mention Ian Hunter, the singer, when he went solo for Mott the Hoople, wrote and recorded in 75, I think it was, a little song called Once Bitten, Twice Shy.
That's right.
And I've heard his version, and the Great White version that became the big hit is pretty faithful to his version.
It is,
Because
and
if you listen to Great White Once Bitten Twice Shy, it doesn't sound like it came from 1989.
no,
It really doesn't.
no,
How many hard rock bands have piano? You
right.
know, so
So the other connection would be this would be the last album that Mick Ralphs played on before.
before that company, yeah, oh yeah, like so many strands of
Absolutely.
Mick Bronson went on to David Bowie's band, and he
Yep.
became a very influential producer. I mean,
Yeah.
he, to bring this into a Canadian 80s perspective, he produced Dal Bello,
Oh wow, I
which
didn't know
is
that.
completely random, right?
Right.
Yeah, cool. So my number 6, actually, I think, yeah, it's the only Canadian artist I have on this list. April Wine with Electric Jewels. Cracks me up every time I see this on these with the arrows. It's like, why were people having problems with this? Yeah. But yeah, this was the third April Wine album. The best known song on here is Weeping Widow, which is another pretty heavy song for 73. That one had the late Jim Clench on vocals, the bass player at the time. He also sings another one of my favorite songs on here called Cat's Claw. This has I Can Hear You Calling, which is kind of a heavy one. The band has just begun. When I saw the band, I've seen the band several times, but one of the times I saw them, they opened with that song. Perfect opener. Just Like That's another cool rocker. Yeah, if you ask a lot of like April Wine fans from the 70s, a lot of times they'll give you this one as their favorite. And it's not mine, but I do really like it. So that's my number 6.
So my number 5 album is the debut by Aerosmith.
Yeah. You got the same version of that I have. There's two slightly different covers.
That's right. So this one has the Walking the Dig misprint
Yeah.
on the.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
on Columbia, this is a Canadian pressing. Yeah, the other version came out after Dream On became a hit.
Yeah, I think
Where
about 76. They
76,
Dream On became a hit in 76. It wasn't a hit right away, but
right.
same version. And
So
yeah,
that,
it's got that same photo of the band, but it's bigger.
yeah,
The logo looks different. They didn't have their logo at this point, and it actually has written on it featuring Dream On.
right. Joe Perry has said that they had no input on that first cover, and when it came out, they hated it. But what were they going to do? They were a young band. This was the first time most of them had ever been in a studio. I think Steven Tyler had been in the studio before this album, but none of the other band members kind of had been in the studio. So it was all a learning experience. They were just happy to have a record deal and be recording. But this album came out the same day as Bruce Springsteen's debut album, January 5th, 1973. Yeah. And Joe Perry has said that every dollar that Aerosmith got for promotion, Bruce got 100. They were really backing Columbia. Columbia wasn't a hard rock label.
No.
So when they were being
they were Bob Dylan's label. They were Simon and Garfunkel's label, right?
That's right. Yeah. The president of the label loved that kind of music, and those seemed to be the acts that he signed. So everybody thought that Aerosmith would end up at Atlantic, Led Zeppelin's label when they were
made a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah.
But
so yeah, Joe Perry said that album got no support for that album. No one, and the big thing was that Rolling Stone didn't even review the album, which in 1973 is absolutely huge.
Yeah.
Behind the 8 ball. He said sometimes they would go to towns that they'd be touring to, and they couldn't even find the album in the record store. So, this was just the start, the stepping stone for the next 4 albums, which are absolute classics. But this one has its moments. Of course, Mama Kin. We talked about Dream On. Mama Kin's probably the other most recognizable song.
Yeah,
covered by Guns N' Roses, but that's my number 5 album, the debut from Aerosmith.
Cool. My number 5 is the 5th album by a little band people might have heard of called Led Zeppelin, Houses of the Holy, with any potential album cover problems taken care of by having this banner over here, which I actually don't mind because I don't really like this album cover that much.
Yeah.
This album actually was supposed to be called Led Zeppelin 5, but they would argue to the last minute what something was going to be called. And this was just another big album for them. The best known song off of here, the biggest charting song was, I didn't know how to say this for years, but it's Jamaica. I say Dire Maker, but it's Jamaica, and it's supposed to sound like Jamaica.
Yeah.
And of course, it's the reggae one. And but I mean, this is a great album. The Song Remains the Same is that's almost progressive. I almost hear like elements of progressive rock in it. The Ocean's a nice, starts out really lush and acoustic, but it kicks in. The Ocean is a good heavy one. Tesla does a really good version of that. No Quarter is this sort of brooding, spacey sounding epic song. I get a kick out of it. It's the Crunge, which is them sort of spoofing like a James Brown
Right.
type of thing. Over the Hills and Far Away is another well-known song off of this one. That's a really good one. I like this entire album. Dancing Days is one that I still hear on the radio sometimes. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's Zeppelin, you know, and it's not my favorite, so it's at number 5.
Yeah. Okay, so number 4 for me, Tim, is we've already talked about this band, so this would be Billion Dollar Babies.
Speaking of great packaging.
Yep. So I've got the inserts here. So I do have the $1 billion bill.
Yeah, that's so cool.
So cool. And the other insert with the band photo and the lyrics.
Yeah, love that.
So it just continues the run of classic albums that they had after Love It to Death, Killer, and School's Out. You know, there's so many great songs that actually were hits on the Billboard 100. No More Mr. Nice Guy, Elected, Hello Hooray, and of course Billion Dollar Babies. But there's other great tracks like Generation Landslide, Unfinished Sweet. I really like that song, and I get the middle part of it. You know, it's a song about going to the dentist. But if they just cut that kind of 2-minute bit out, that would be a really great song. But I get it. It's Alice doing Alice things, and you know, it's that's my number 4 album, Billion Dollar Babies by Alice Cooper.
Right on. So my number 4, we just saw not very long ago at all, is the debut Aerosmith album. And yeah, I mean, I can't add much more to what Andy said about it. It does have some great songs on it. Moving Out is one of my favorites. It's the first song Stephen and Joe ever wrote together. And speaking of songs that were covered, Walking the Dog. Walking the Dog's a cover on here to begin with by Rufus Thomas.
Yeah.
But a lot of people know it because Rat did an excellent version of it on their excellent EP from 1983. One Way Street I've always liked too. Make It, the opener, is really cool. And another thing about this album, if someone were to go back and listen to it, Steven Tyler's voice sounds very different on this album. I guess he was very, very nervous in the studio, and you listen to it, it sounds, he sounds like much, much younger. And Dream On is sort of his actual voice, but even it sounds a little bit different, but you can tell who it is. But yeah, he said many times that red light would come on and he would just freeze up.
Yeah.
And it's amazing what a good producer can do, because this was not produced by Jack Douglas. Jack Douglas stepped up for the next 4 albums. And from the opening of, you know, Same Old Song and Dance on Get Your Wings, even if you've never heard the song before, you'd go, well, that's Aerosmith. That's Steven Tyler. So this album's a little bit out of character, but I still think it has some good songs on it. And, you know, based on what came after and the fact that it's got Dream On it, it went on to, you know, be a, you know, multi-million seller.
Yeah. Yeah, I forgot Rat did a cover of Walking the Dog. The Rolling Stones did a cover of it in the 60s.
Yes, right.
As well, it's a much covered song, but
I think Rat modeled their cover after Aerosmith's more than anything.
Yeah, and Aerosmith modeled theirs after the Stones.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so my number 3 album, and you've already talked about it. It's Houses of the Love.
Yeah.
I'm not going to show the cover. That's the inner sleeve.
Yeah.
My copy is a Canadian pressing on the old red and green label. I can't add much to what we've already talked about to this album. I also like The Song Remains the Same, kicks that off. Like you say, it's I think 2 minutes before they get into any vocals. It's a really good opener. You know, this album really got mixed reviews, and Rolling Stone absolutely trashed this album, calling them the limp blimp, and said they'd get laughed off of the island of Jamaica if they tried to play their reggae Jamaica in Jamaica. So really got mixed reviews, but I think at this point, being the biggest band in the world, arguably. They really didn't care.
Oh,
They
the
want
criticism just, it's like, laugh all the way to the bank, right?
that break. So they wanted to kind of do the songs that they wanted to do, and you're bang on with the crunge and the James Brown ripoff kind of play that they did on that. But yeah, it's not my favorite Zeppelin album either, but it is a good album from start to finish.
Yeah, had the pleasure of seeing the classic albums live crew with Nick Walsh on lead vocals do that at the Playhouse in Fredericton. I would like to see it again. It was cool hearing those songs I'd never seen live versions of, especially the Crunch, because that's a complicated one. But
yeah.
So my number 3 is an album that we just saw, $1 Billion Babies. And yeah, this was a number 1 album. It was Alice's only number 1 album, and yeah, it was unusual for an album at this time to have multiple hit singles. Usually somebody would have 1, maybe 2 if you were a hard rock act. Yeah, I really like this album. It's funny. Do you remember in the late 80s and into the early 90s listening to pirate radio on Saturday nights? I remember listening to it in probably 89, 90, and it was a Halloween episode, and it was the first time I ever heard I Love the Dead, which on album honestly isn't much of a song, but you see it on stage and it's like it wouldn't be the same without that whole part of the show, right? So, but it's a really good album.
So getting down to the top 2, my number 2,
I'm really curious.
Montrose, debut album from Montrose, of course produced by Ted Templeton, and again on the
Burbank Warner label, yeah.
Yeah. So this is just an all-time hard rock classic in my opinion. I mean, it's only 8 songs. It's like half an hour in length, but every one of the songs is, to me, there's not a bum track on there. Bad Motor Scooter, Ronnie Montrose playing the slide guitar to make it sound like a motorcycle, like just incredible guitar playing.
Yeah, what does that make you think of a few years later? And Mick Mars has said that. That's where he got the idea for Kickstart My Heart. Yeah.
Yeah. And the solo on that song as well is just blistering. Space Station number 5, another great, like, kind of just gem of a hard rock song. Rock Candy has kind of a Zeppelin drum intro to it. And of course, young Sammy Hagar would have some Ted Templeton connections later on.
Yeah.
And Don Landy actually engineered this album as well. He would engineer, I think, the first 6 Van Halen albums, and then would co-produce the next couple with Sammy in the band, I think.
Yeah, the production credits were always kind of nebulous as to, they would say recorded by, but yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. Eddie Van Halen has said that this album was hugely influential on him, and I think Van Halen covered "Make It Last," which is the closer. They covered that during their club days. So
they did Rock Candy too. So yes, folks, it is possible to go on YouTube and find David Lee Roth singing a Sammy Hagar song. It is possible.
It's possible. So you talk about pirate radio. So I learned of this band, I think it would have been about 91. I had never heard of this band before, but I had gone to Portland to see a concert, and I listened to a station down there in Z-Rock, was the hard rock station. So I couldn't believe the music they were playing, because back where we're from, there was nothing like that on the radio. It was top 40 and that was it at the time. So I came home and I was actually able to pick up that Portland station late at night, kind of in my room.
Yeah.
I was able to just get it in, and Sunday nights they had the top 50 countdown of the week, and through commercials, I think on the station, they were talking about this top 1,000 of all time on Z-Rock. So I actually wrote to the radio station and asked them if they had a copy of that top 1,000, and they actually mailed it to me.
Awesome.
So I had a paper copy of this top 1,000 hard rock songs from this radio station. At number 28, I think, was Rock Candy by Montrose. And out of the top 100, that was probably the only band I had never heard of before. So I had to find out who it was. And I think my brother was going to Montreal. I said, hey, if you see this CD, pick it up for me. And that was my introduction to Montrose.
little more on that in a bit. Yeah. Number two, my number two. This is one of the few 8 tracks I have from the UK, and it would have come with a color slipcase, but it did. The version I have, it's lost, so I've got a black and white. It's the first Queen album. I know it's hard to see there because it is in black and white, but this is the debut album from Queen, 1973. I think it came out July 14th. And I mean, this started off an incredible career of a band that just broke all kinds of musical boundaries, and to this day their music is popular. I don't think there'll ever be a day when you won't hear "We Will Rock You" and "We Are the Champions" at a sporting event, or another one bites the dust, or Bohemian Rhapsody. Now this album, the best known song on it is probably the opening track, "Keep Yourself Alive." Wasn't a hit in North America, but it's got some heavy stuff on it. Modern Times Rock and Roll is a really heavy, fast one, sung by Roger Taylor, the drummer, who had the awesome raspy voice. It's sort of a trial run for a song they do 2 albums later, another really fast song called Stone Cold Crazy. So yeah, there's heavy stuff in there. Liar's a really heavy one. Son and Daughter is heavy. Great King Rat's a heavy one. But then, there are mellow stuff. There's mellow stuff on here like Doing All Right and The Night Comes Down. I mean, but for a debut album, it sounds so very well accomplished. Basically, Queen worked, graveyard hours at Trident Studios when other bands weren't recording. So they didn't have to pay for recording time, or they got it really cheap. So they'd load in, but it doesn't sound like it was done piecemeal. It sounds like this band just kind of dropped out of nowhere. And even though they were in their, just mid to late 20s, at that point, they were just all like geniuses. So there was no growing pains. You know what I mean? Like some bands take a while to get up to speed. Queen had it down right from the beginning. Now, what they didn't have at this point was the ability to write concise, catchy songs, or they weren't going in that direction, but they very, very soon would. But yeah, that's my number two. It's their first album.
Awesome. So we're down to number one, and for me, it is Black Sabbath. Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. And
this
again,
has been said before, Andy, but how did that album make it to store shelves in 1973? Like, I don't remember I never read about there being any uproar about that, but
I don't either. Like even the back cover where you've got some kind of but yeah, the front of it is definitely would have been controversial in 1973.
Yeah. Well, it looks like a poster for a horror movie.
Yeah. And another one on the Warner Burbank label. And it also came with a lyric sheet. So this actually made it to number 11 on Billboard, surprisingly. At this point, the band didn't get a whole lot of positive reviews for their music, but this one actually did. The band went back to the same studio that they used for their Volume 4 album in Los Angeles. Tony Iommi had writer's block. He couldn't come up with any ideas at all. They went back to England. They kind of went into this castle and set up in the basement of this castle, kind of like a dungeon. And at one point, Geezer Butler, the bass player, he thought the band was breaking up because they weren't coming up with anything. They'd come off the road. They were exhausted. They had obviously super substance abuse. But Tony Iommi came up with the riff for Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. And he said after he got that riff, everything just kind of flowed from there. National Acrobat, Spiral Architect are 2 really good tracks on there that are kind of deeper cuts that the average Sabbath fan might not know of. Sabracadabra, of course, was covered by Metallica on Garage Inc. And the aforementioned Rick Wakeman played the mini Moog and the keyboards on that song. Kirk Hammett has said that "Killing Yourself to Live" is actually his favorite Black Sabbath song, and it's also on this album. So that's my number one album of 1973. That's Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think Metallica's cover of Sabracadabra, in the middle of it, they go into, is it a National Acrobat? Like they go into that section and then back into
yeah, really cool.
Awesome. So my number one has already been mentioned, and I knew right from the beginning this was going to be it for me. It's the first Montrose album. Now, you look at it, it looks like a yacht rock album. It doesn't exactly look like a hard rock album, but don't let that throw you. This is a killer album. Like Ted Templeman's production for 1973 is so smooth and so clean and so ahead of its time. If I had found this album looking for it and it had a copyright date of 1980 on it, I wouldn't have given it a second thought. It sounds so good,
Yeah.
especially Make It Last and Rock Candy, those huge drum sounds out of Denny Carmassi. Like most of the people in this band were, either were or would be known in other capacities. So Denny Carmassi played on this album. He played in Sammy's solo band for many years, but he was also a member of Heart when they had their big comeback in the mid 80s. He's in all those videos.
Right.
He even played on the Coverdale Page album.
Oh, wow.
So
I didn't.
he made the rounds. Bass player Bill Church, or the Electric Church, was in Sammy's solo band for many years. And Ronnie Montrose came from playing with the Edgar Winter Band, and also Van Morrison he played with, and he went on to produce different bands. He did a lot of solo albums, like instrumental albums. I think he had something to do with the beginning of Tesla's career.
Oh, okay.
Or introducing them to someone, but yeah, because he's a Bay Area guy, right? And of course, Sammy Hagar. I mean, his vocals on here are just blistering.
Yeah.
This is where it all begins. And even people that, and I'm not one of them, but even people that hate Van Halen with Sammy Hagar, just not a fan of his solo stuff, usually will say, yeah, but this is a good album. This is one of those ones. And where I first heard about this is, I love these stories about how you hear about things, because people have to understand that pre-internet, you couldn't just look things up.
Right.
I love the idea that you wrote Z-Rock. That's the kind of thing that I would have wanted to do, but I would have been too shy to do for some reason. But I first heard of this band in mid '88. I found a cassette from Sammy Hagar called Red Hot, and it was one of those cheap looking truck stop tapes, right? Like they weren't actual albums, and it was just, I had enough money to get one more cassette, and I said, well, I like Sammy and Van Halen. I like Can't Drive 55. I mean, I don't know any songs on this, but I'm going to pick it up. And it was actually a mix of songs from two actual live albums. And two of the songs were Bad Motor Scooter and Space Station Number 5. Now, in '89, I found a Hit Parader top 100 metal albums of all time. You can look this up online. You can find it. It's got a blue cover. It's got Robert Plant on the cover. It's got Motley Crue, got James Hetfield. Like you could get this if you wanted, but it had somewhere way down the list in the '70s. I think it had a weird picture of Ronnie Montrose, because he had a guitar that looked like a gun. It had a gun sight on it, and I'm like, what is this? So I start reading about it, and it said something about the bellows of a young singer named Sammy Hagar, and it listed Bad Motor Scooter and Space Station Number 5. So I'm like, oh, that's where those songs came from. And it just so happened, I went to Moncton for a family vacation, and I found this cassette. And at the time that I bought this, it was the oldest thing that I owned.
Wow.
Up until then, the oldest album in my collection was the first Rush album, but this was a year earlier. And it's one of my favorite albums ever. I mean, I just love it. And I love the fact that I didn't know how well regarded it was at the time, but over the years, I found out that, yeah, a lot of people like this album. Later that summer, we talked about Z-Rock. We talked about Pirate Radio. You must remember Metal Shop.
I do remember Metal Shop. I remember hearing about it. I don't think I ever heard it, or.
It was a syndicated radio show. It actually started like way into the early '80s, like '83 or '84. And their tagline was that they were the only show with teeth. And there was a hard rock metal, basically audio magazine. They had interviews, but they play lots of songs. And I heard songs that I'd never heard before for the first time, especially the summer of '89. I listened to it the most. And one night, I remember I was at my family's cottage at the lake, and I was listening to the radio. It was on late Sunday night. It started at, I think, 11 o'clock at night. It was a 2-hour long show. And all of a sudden, Lars Ulrich and Jason Newsted come on. And it was a special show where they counted down the top 20 metal bands of all time, or the top 20 metal songs of all time. I don't know exactly what it was, but I listened. I'm like, oh, this is neat. It's the first time I ever heard Detroit Rock City. It's the first time I ever heard Toys in the Attic. It's the first time I ever heard um, what else did they? They played an old Scorpions song. They have a song called "Catch Your Train." Um, yeah,
Maybe.
I don't know, but it was I don't know, but they played "Muscle of Love" by Alice Cooper. Um, I was couldn't be more blown away because even then I was a huge Rush fan. They played 2112 Overture, Temples of Syrinx, and they were both going on about how they liked Rush. I'm like, I knew these guys were cool.
Yeah.
And they played Space Station Number 5, and they were going on about what a great album this first Montrose album is. So that really justified it for me. And I shudder to think that people, overlook this album because of the cover, because it's not a very rocking looking cover. But this album was a slow burner. I mean, it didn't do very well upon release, but it was eventually certified platinum. There you go. That's even better / worse. But it was eventually certified platinum in 1986. And I have to wonder if it was a recertification process, because what happened with Sammy Hagar in 1986 on Warner Brothers, that they might have been like, hey, let's, and like you said, it was so influential. Van Halen were influenced by it. I mean, so you had Ted Templeman and Don Landy producing. You had a band named after their guitar player. And you had they were heavy, but they weren't doomy like Sabbath. There was a commercial aspect to them. Gee, that was pretty much the template for an album that came out 5 years later, and it's Sammy Hagar on vocals. But if they'd have stayed together and kept putting out records like this, I bet you they would have been one of the biggest bands of the '70s. But they only lasted with Sammy for one more album, Paper Money, which was nowhere near as good as this album. And Ronnie Montrose was one of those, when I think of, he's sadly no longer with us, but I think of him as almost like a Vinnie Vincent type of character, someone that just couldn't stand the idea of being successful and just
Right.
had to sabotage everything at every turn.
Yeah.
But for this one brief moment, they had a killer album. People will know songs on this from other artists. Rock Candy's probably the most popular one. Lee Aaron did a version of this. I think it's on Body Rock.
Didn't Cinderella, was it Cinderella that did it
Bullet
for Wayne?
Boys.
Bullet Boys.
Yeah, Bullet Boys, which would have also been produced by Ted Templeman, I would imagine.
Probably, yeah.
They did a version of it. Tesla do a great version of Make It Last on the Reel to Reel Volume 2, I think, which is awesome because for, Jeff Keith's audition, or one of the first times anyone in Tesla, I think Frankie Hannon heard him sing, he was singing Your Love Is Driving Me Crazy by Sammy Hagar. And I always thought, boy, yeah, he'd sound really good singing a Sammy Hagar song. And so they did Make It Last and confirmed, yeah, he does sound really good singing that. But there's also a B-side where they do Rock the Nation, which is pretty cool as well. And I want to say Quiet Riot covered Rock the Nation, but I don't know in what time period.
Okay.
It could. I don't know if it was Kevin DuBrow. It might have been a latter day, or I might be completely confused. All I know is that it's full of great songs. I think one of the best guitar solos on here, because that's one thing. Ronnie Montrose wasn't a shredder, so it's not like when people listen to this thinking it's going to be like Van Halen, not in that capacity. But their cover of "Good Rockin' Tonight," he's got some pretty fast licks in that song. So yeah, to me, this is just an effortlessly enjoyable album. If you like Sammy and you've never gone back this far, it's worth it.
Right.
I've always thought Hagar works best in a band context, and this is good.
Yeah.
Good choice. So yeah,
that truck stop cassette that you had. So at that, when you heard those two songs that were Montrose songs, you just thought they were Sammy Hagar songs.
I had no reason to think otherwise, right? And I also would have thought, once I knew about this album via that hit parader, oh, I must be looking for an album on Capitol Records, because Sammy's early stuff was all on Capitol. And I don't know how I spotted it, because it was just one of those, well, it would have looked like, it would look something like this, but on cassette, right? Just said Montrose. I could very well have missed it, and boy, I'm glad I spotted it. And I'm glad that those songs were on it, because then I said, is this what I think it is? And I looked at the back, and when you really look at it, you go, well, yeah, that's Sammy. But I mean, on a picture on the side, a cassette, it's like, I don't know. When you had your allowance and you only had so much money to spend, you didn't want to blow it, right? But that was a really good investment. I've got the Rhino Records reissue of it that's got a radio show on it which has a couple of unreleased songs on it. So
Cool.
yeah, it's so good. So there you go, guys. That's our top 10 albums, with hopefully a little bit of insight into how we, got into them all the way back to 1973, 50 years ago. To me, 1973 is, with the advent of Montrose, or might as well just say Sammy Hagar, Queen, Aerosmith. To me, this is kind of the modern world beginning, for the music that I would end up really, really into, and even more so in the following year. But yeah, some really strong albums. I'm sure there's a lot of folks that would say, how can you limit it to 10? But, for me, I'm an 80s guy. So to me, these all paved the way in some way or another for.
One that I thought that I might see from you, which neither one of us had on our list, was the debut from Skynyrd.
I thought that's definitely, that would have been in the top 15, pronounced Leonard Skynyrd, because that's a really good album. That's got, Freebird, everybody knows Freebird. Most people now know Simple Man.
Yep.
Those first appeared in the first album, but
Tuesday's Gone also on that one.
Tuesday's Gone. There's another one Metallica did, right?
Yep.
But I always like that song anyway. But seems to me there's a heavy one on there that I realize that's not On the Hunt, but it's gone right out of my head. I Ain't the One.
I Ain't the One.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, that was Hovering. Yeah, that was Hovering for sure.
Figured.
So there you go. That's our picks. And if you stay tuned to Tim's Vinyl Confessions, we're going to fast forward a few years, and we're going to have a bigger presentation with more of us on here. You can probably guess, because it's the music that we're kind of all centered on here. So won't give away much more than that, but think you're going to enjoy it. Thanks for coming on, Bug. I really, really enjoyed doing this. We had a lot in common. I think we had more in common than not, but yeah, it was good variety. And yeah, man, like 1973 was pivotal. So much good stuff came out.
Yeah, no, it was a fun episode to do. Thanks for having me, Tim.
No problem. All right, guys, make sure and hit subscribe if you haven't already. And we will see you next time on Tim's Vinyl Confessions.